Well, I tend to look at it from an economic financial point of view, and very clearly, the peak of the empire was sometime before 2008, maybe in those first early years of the 21st century. But since then, the crisis in 2008-9 shows a weakening of the global economy and the U.S. role in it. Never really recovered from 2008, only partially. And then, of course, we had COVID hit, and that was another major crisis, another what I call epic recession, to differentiate from normal recessions and from depressions. The media, Paul Krugman and others, called it a great recession, but I always had issues with them because great is kind of like describing it with adverbs, never really saying how it is different. And my 2020 book, The Scourge of Neoliberalism, is really about the policies that were introduced by the United States in the late 70s, early 80s, in response to the political economic crisis of the 70s, sometimes called neoliberalism, which was really a way of gaining some more time for the empire. And it did. It was successful. The neoliberal policies, starting with Reagan, actually with Carter, and ever since, did buy the U.S. empire some time and actually strengthened the empire in some ways. It dealt with foreign challengers to the empire, Europe, Japan. We used to talk about Japan Inc. back then in the 80s, challenging the U.S. Well, they put that to rest. The U.S. Imperialists put that to rest. They tamed that. And they tamed the social movements of the 70s. And they broke up the big industrial unions and construction unions in the United States. So neoliberalism has always had two main class objectives. One was to deal with their challengers domestically as well as their competitors globally. And it was quite successful in that sense. And then, of course, the Soviet Union imploded. And that challenge, that source was dealt with in the early 90s. And the empire just went on a tear after that. And the neocons took control under late Clinton, a foreign policy, and they've been wrecking it ever since. And domestically, they kind of turned all the deregulation, privatization, turned the big corporations and finance capital loose in the late 90s, early 2000s. So it was the heyday, the first 7 or 8 years here of the 21st century. And, then they had 9/11, which gave them an excuse to really go aggressively into wars. And we've been in wars in the U.S. ever since, ever since 2001. Actually, we were in smaller wars consistently ever since before. But the big war on terror, really boosted the American military and the empire. So the empire was expanding geographically and financially and economically all during early neoliberalism until it hit the wall in 2008. Clearly, my view on Ukraine is, this was precipitated by NATO and by the U.S. I wrote an article in January 2022, which is on my blog, jackrasmus.com, published in a number of blogs, called 10 Reasons Why the U.S. May Want Russia to Invade Ukraine. And I laid out, the objectives and the advantages and goals that the U.S. would achieve by provoking, Putin and the Russians to invade. They wanted them to invade. They had a lot to gain, The big gain, of course, was they drove the Russians out of the Western European economy totally, not just out of the energy sector. They just opened up a big vacuum that American capital stepped right in, not just the energy companies, but all the other companies, that were exiting, particularly the U.S. banks, so forth, just made a big penetration. So one of the big positive outcomes for the empire was it increased its control over Europe economically. We're selling natural gas to Europe 4 times the price the Russians were, and that's causing, particularly in the industrial parts of Europe like Germany, some real problems. Companies going bankrupt. Deindustrialization of Germany now they're now talking about going on. So the U.S. has really captured Western Europe in a significant way as a result of the war and, of course, the sanctions. The dollar is the linchpin of the global empire. If the dollar collapses, then it reverberates throughout the whole empire and the U.S. economy. Obviously, the BRICS are the big challenger right now, and the expansion of the BRICS. Now you got 5 of them, which are in the Middle East. They're adding oil to the whole mix there, the control of oil, and the major manufacturing country of the world, China and Russia and so forth. That's a real threat, and you got to understand that threat and that decline of the dollar was accelerated by the Ukraine war and the sanctions. And seizing of 300 billion of Russian assets, which is just a warning to the global South. You mess with the U.S., we're going to just freeze everything you got. So that's why we see an acceleration of the BRICS as an antipole to the American empire. And I see a bifurcation of the U.S. global empire coming, where the U.S. rallies its closest allies here, circles the wagons, Europe, Japan, Australia, and they try to defend themselves from that stronghold, you might say. And the global South, a good part of it, not all of it, but a good part of it allies itself with the BRICS. And then you got a third element that just tries to play both against the middle, right? So a trifecta of whatever, of what's going on with the global empire. But, it means the decline of the dollar if you get the BRICS starting to trade with an alternative currency or some sort of basket of currencies or solutions, oil is at the basis or whatever instead of the dollar. That's coming. There's going to be the conference in Petersburg here at the end of the year. You got 34 other countries who have petitioned to join the BRICS. Out of that will come, as they say, a new financial structure, global structure. That will be a currency of some kind or basket of currency. That will be a new international payment system instead of the SWIFT that the U.S. uses to enforce its sanctions. That will be has to be some sort of alternative institution to the IMF to maintain currency stability. You've got the Belt and Road, which is already a new World Bank in the making, Shanghai Cooperative Zone, and so forth. This is the real threat to the dollar. And if you got an alternative currency, then you're not going to use the dollar as much for transactions or reserves.
Dr. Jack Rasmus is the author of several books on the USA and global economy, including The Scourge of Neoliberalism, U.S. Economic Policy from Reagan to Trump and Systemic Fragility in the Global Economy. He is a host for the Alternative Visions radio show on the Progressive Radio Network, a journalist, playwright and former professor of economics at St. Mary's College, retired. He formerly worked for 20 years for various tech startups and global companies, prior to which he was an organizer and local union president for 15 years for several American unions. The Twilight of American Imperialism describes the political, military, economic, and cultural aspects of imperialism, and how these practices have been employed over the course of the 250-year rise, ascendance, and present decline of the American imperial project. Special attention is paid to identifying the distinctive characteristics particular to the American empire in its phase as dominant hegemon after the mid-20th century, as well as on the internal contradictions and external forces responsible for its emerging decline in the 21st. The book predicts the likely trajectory of U.S. imperialism over the next decade, 2025 to 2035, as it confronts intensifying challenges from the BRICS and the Global South.